Oh, how many severed heads and bones of the dead we then found lying upon the plains near the sea. These people, inexperienced in the use of an arrow, the Turks had annihilated. Arrows were shot from the bows, and destructive stones were hurled. Our enemy fired at us, and we at them. The air was lashed, with a great outcry from men, women, and children, as well as from the pagans who rushed upon us. About 10,000 were beheaded. Your feet would have been stained up to the ankles with the blood of the slain. Cut pieces from the buttocks of the Saracens, they devoured it with savage mouths. What more shall I tell? Not one of them was allowed to live.
Last time we immersed ourselves into an eyewitness account of the First Crusade. We learned that Pope Urban II pleaded for the conquest of the Holy Lands, and that many knights and common folk answered his call. These armies gathered as their rulers saw fit and traversed towards the east. We heard how they were all greeted by Emperor Alexios I in Constantinople, and how at the Battle of Nicaea, these small armies amassed into a huge one. Just before Nicaea fell, the emperor managed to work out the surrender of the city so that he could protect the citizens and his property. Keep in mind, not so long ago, this entire region was under Byzantine rule. So, naturally, they didn't want a bunch of Western savages destroying it all. After being duped by the Byzantines, the Crusaders marched on. There was more plunder waiting for them further east. Even so, for our priest, this conquest was not about material possessions, but about faith in God. And the last we heard of him, his army was getting ready for battle.
Then, with flags flying, we went out against the enemy in good order. At the second hour of the day, behold, their advanced guards approached our scouts. When we had heard this, we pitched our tents near a certain marsh and took off our pack saddles so that we would be better able to fight. When this was done, the emir and chief of the Turks, Suleiman, who had held in his possession the city of Nicaea and Romania, gathered about him the Turks and pagan Persians, who, after a journey of 30 days at his command, had come to his aid. Altogether, they numbered 360,000 fighters, all on horses and armed with bows, as was their custom. We, on the other hand, had both foot soldiers and knights. But at that time, Duke Godfrey and Count Raymond and Hugh the Great had been 2 days absent from us. Therefore, an irreparable loss resulted, as much of the number of our soldiers who were killed as from our failure to kill or capture the Turks, and because those absent leaders received our messages late, they were therefore late in coming to our aid. The Turks crept up howling loudly and shooting a shower of arrows. Stunned and almost dead, with many wounded, we immediately fled. And it was no wonder, for such warfare was new to us all. Already, from another part of the marsh, a large column of them rushed violently up to our tents, and entering them, snatched our possessions and killed our people. What further shall I say? We were all huddled together like sheep shut in a pen, trembling and frightened, surrounded on all sides by the enemies. The air was lashed, with a great outcry from men, women, and children, as well as from the pagans who rushed upon us. Now, there was no hope of life left to us. Many, fearing the death was near, ran to the priests and confessed their sins. Weeping they sang, and singing they wept.
According to our priest, after the Crusaders had left Nicaea, they learned that the Turks were about to ambush them. Having defeated them once before, they did not worry too much. But soon, they found out that after he fled Nicaea, the Turkish general asked for reinforcements and was now commanding a much larger army. The Crusaders were overwhelmed and retreated to protect their equipment and non-combatants. At the very last moment, when they felt like all hope was lost, the cavalry arrived.
Then, by the disposition of God, the advanced guard of Hugh the Great and Count Raymond and Duke Godfrey came from the rear on this unhappy scene. From the very first hour of the day until the 6th, as I have said, difficulties checked us. But then, little by little, we recovered and were reinforced by our allies. Indeed, we continued our journey quietly, one day suffering such extreme thirst that many men and women died from its torments. Whole troops of Turks, fleeing before us, sought refuge by scattering throughout Romania. In these regions, we were very often in need of bread and other foods, for we found Romania, a land which is good and very rich in all products, thoroughly devastated and ravished by the Turks. Truly, one would not know whether to laugh or cry from pity when many of our men without pack mules, since many of theirs had already perished, loaded sheep, goats, hogs and dogs with their supplies, such as clothing and food and whatever luggage was necessary for pilgrims, and knights with their armor, sometimes even mounted oxen. And who had ever heard such a mixture of languages in one army? There were Franks, Flemish, Frisians, Gauls, Lotharingians, Bavarians, Normans, Angles, Scots, Italians, Iberians, Bretons, Greeks, and Armenians. If a Breton questioned me, I would not know how to answer either. But though we spoke diverse languages, we were, however, brothers in the love of God and seemed to be nearest kin. For if one lost any of his possessions, whoever found it, kept it carefully a long time until by inquiry, he found the loser and returned it to him.
I believe what the priest is describing here is the same sense of brotherhood modern soldiers experience today. Once you get into the thick of a battle with someone, and you help each other out, there is no greater bond of friendship. So, no matter how much we evolve, in some aspects, we are the same as our ancestors thousands of years ago. After their ambush proved to be unsuccessful, the Turks employed a scorched earth policy upon their retreat, leaving nothing for the Crusaders to live on. But they persevered and managed to get to Antioch. What ensued was later labeled as one of the most interesting sieges in history. Stephen of Blois described Antioch as a city very extensive, fortified with incredible strength and almost impregnable. And he was right. Although the Crusaders hoped they would manage to force a capitulation or find a traitor inside the city, that proved to be a difficult task. After 8 months of siege, thousands of Crusaders had already died from starvation. Stephen of Blois deserted, but even worse, he informed Emperor Alexios that it was a lost cause. The emperor then returned his armies to Constantinople and never reached Antioch. Several Turkish armies tried relieving the siege, with no success. But when the Crusaders heard that a Mosul army of 40,000 men, under the command of Kerboga, crossed the river Tigris, many of them lost hope. At the last minute, one of the leaders of the crusade by the name of Bohemund of Taranto found an Armenian guard by the name of Firuz, who was in command of the Tower of Two Sisters. He was angry at the Turks because his wife left him for a Turkish officer, so he lowered a ladder down the wall. A few knights got inside and opened the gates. Even though the Crusaders poured in, the majority of the Turks barricaded themselves in the citadel. The fight was not over yet, and Kerboga started crushing them from the outside. Supposedly, that's when a man named Peter found the Holy Lance in the city. With God at their side, the Crusaders managed to defeat the enemy. The siege was a success. However, the army was plagued with sickness and weariness, and there was a rift between the leaders, and it was threatening to spoil the plans. Antioch was only halfway on the route from Constantinople to Jerusalem. During this time, parts of the army went on to capture other cities. This is how our priest describes what happened next.
When our men and their horses, who had been wearied by much labor for many days, were refreshed by food and rest for 4 months at Antioch, they resumed their former strength. Having arranged a plan, one part of the army went into inner Syria, desiring to delay the march to Jerusalem. Other princes remained in the vicinity of Antioch. Count Raymond and his people seized Bara and Mara by a courageous attack. After the former city was captured quickly and completely depopulated by the slaughter of its citizens, and everything which they found there had been seized, they hastened to the other city. Here, when the siege had lasted 20 days, our people suffered excessive hunger. I shudder to tell that many of our people, harassed by the madness of excessive hunger, cut pieces from the buttocks of the Saracens already dead there, which they cooked. But when it was not yet roasted enough by the fire, they devoured it with savage mouths. So the besiegers, rather than the besieged, were tormented. Meanwhile, after they made what machines they could and moved them to the wall in an assault with great boldness, with God favoring, the Franks entered over the top of the wall. And on that day and the following, they killed all the Saracens, from the greatest to the least, and plundered all their substance. And so, Count Raymond, after Tancred joined him, continued the journey to Jerusalem.
Before we go to Jerusalem, it's important to point to the fact that, despite the religious zeal, this was a military campaign. Even before the Siege of Antioch, several knights went their separate ways to conquer territories for themselves. As for Bohemund of Taranto, before he stormed Antioch, he made an agreement with the other leaders that, if his plan worked out and they managed to seize the city, he would be named Prince of Antioch. Since Emperor Alexios failed to aid them, he figured the previous arrangement, where they would return all territories to the Byzantine Empire, was no longer valid. So different territories ruled by Western noblemen started popping out throughout the region. It turns out that the Crusade was indeed a lucrative opportunity for many. But let's check in with our priest and see what he is up to.
The city of Jerusalem is situated in a mountainous region, lacking in streams, woods, and springs. Here there is sufficient water sometimes, but occasionally the supply is reduced by drawing off the water. When the Franks viewed the city and saw it would be difficult to take, our princess ordered wooden ladders be made. By erecting them against the wall, they hoped to scale it, and by a fierce attack enter the city, with God helping. After they had done this, when the leaders gave the signal and the trumpets sounded, in morning's bright light of the 7th day following, they rushed upon the city from all sides in an astonishing attack. After consultation, craftsmen were ordered to build machines so that by moving them to the walls, they might with God's aid obtain the desired end. So this was done. After the machines were prepared, they again prepared to assail the city. Early in the same morning, when they gathered the machines and other auxiliary weapons, they very quickly erected the tower in compact shape, not far from the wall. After it was set up and well covered by hides on the outside, by pushing it, they slowly moved it nearer the wall. Then, a few but brave soldiers, at the signal of the horn, climbed onto the tower. Nevertheless, the Saracens defended themselves from those soldiers, and with slings hurled firebrands dipped in oil and grease at the tower, and at the soldiers who were in it. Thereafter, death was present and sudden, for many on both sides.
Let me just make another quick interlude here. The Turkish governor of Jerusalem, Iftikhar al-Dawla, had been preparing for the siege. Hearing about the betrayal at Antioch, he expelled all Eastern Christians from the city. He cut down all the trees around Jerusalem and poisoned all the wells. The city was protected by a wall that was 3 meters thick, 15 meters high, and stretched for 4 kilometers. There were also 5 major gates, protected by 2 towers each. The Crusaders divided into 2 groups and started attacking on 2 fronts. After the equipment was sent from Europe, the Crusaders were able to build 2 massive wheel-mounted siege towers, a battering ram with an ironclad head, and many scaling ladders and other siege tools. The siege lasted for 1 month and 8 days. Here's how our priest remembered it.
On the following day, at the blast of the trumpets, they undertook the same work, but more vigorously, so that by hammering in one place by the battering rams, they breached the wall. The Franks entered the city magnificently on the noonday hour on Friday, the day of the week when Christ redeemed the whole world on the cross. With trumpets sounding and with everything in an uproar, exclaiming, "Help God!" they vigorously pushed into the city and straightway raised the banner on the top of the wall. All the heathen, completely terrified, changed their boldness to swift flight through the narrow streets of the quarters. The more quickly they fled, the more quickly they were put to flight. On the top of Solomon's temple, to which they had climbed in fleeing, many were shot down with arrows and cast down headlong from the roof. Within this temple, about 10,000 were beheaded. If you had been there, your feet would have been stained up to the ankles with the blood of the slain. What more shall I tell? Not one of them was allowed to live. They did not spare the women and children. After they had discovered the cleverness of the Saracens, it was an extraordinary thing to see our squires and poorer people split the bellies of these Saracens so that they might pick out coins from their intestines, which they had swallowed down their horrible gullets while alive. After several days, they made a great heap of their bodies and burned them to ashes. And in these ashes, they found the gold more easily. O time so longed for, O time remembered among all others, O deed to be preferred before all deeds. This is the place where the Creator of all creatures, God, made man in his manifold mercy for the human race, brought the gift of spiritual rebirth. Here he was born, died and rose, cleansed from the contagion of heathen, inhabiting it at one time or another, so long contaminated by their superstition, it was restored to its former rank by those believing and trusting in him.
Strange that such a holy endeavor resulted in such unholy acts of butchery. Even if you disregard the cutting of corpses to get gold coins out of them, the fact is that thousands of Muslims and Jews were massacred by the Crusaders. Yes, the Holy Land was under Christian rule once again, but at a terrible cost. Let me know if you enjoyed this video. If you'd like me to do more of these first-hand accounts of battles and important events from history, let me know. See you next time.